Today's lecture will consist of two sessions. First, there will be a keynote speech by Professor Thomas Piketty, and it will be followed by a panel discussion and a QA session. Without further ado, may I invite President of the Education University of Hong Kong, Professor Stephen Cheung, to deliver his welcome address. Professor Cheung, please.
Professor Thomas Piketty, Mr. Anthony Leung, Mr. Journo, distinguished guests, colleagues and students, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. It's my honor and privilege to welcome Professor Thomas Piketty and all of you to our university today. I'm so happy to see a full house here. I mean, my student may not be able to grab a seat in this lecture theater. We have to open another theater, next to here, and to have a live broadcast of Professor Piketty's talk. Professor Piketty knows introduction. We all know that he's an internationally renowned economist from France, and his best-selling book, Capital in the 21st Century, together with the numerous articles he's authored, has triggered an intellectual debate on global inequality, a subject that is central to the work of policymakers, NGOs, economists, educators, and think tanks around the world. In the works of Nobel Prize laureate Paul Krugman, in his review of the seminal book, forgive my beginner French. My French teacher sitting there, she will correct me if I say something wrong. Piketty a transformé notre discours économique. Nous ne parlerons plus jamais de richesse et de qualité de la même manière. In English, Piketty has changed our economic analysis. We will no longer speak about wealth and equality as before. EdUHK is proud to present this lecture. Our special thanks go to Consulate Général of France in Hong Kong and Macau, and the Hong Kong Jockey Club Charity Trust for making it possible. Today's lecture kicks off our distinguished lecture series in French culture and education, for which we will bring more world-class speakers from France to this campus in the future. As a former member of the Commission on Poverty, I take a keen interest in today's topic. I'm sure that Professor Piketty's presence, as well as his thought-provoking ideas and critical insights, will stimulate and enrich further deliberations on rising inequalities globally. Once again, I welcome you all for coming today, and trust you will find Professor Piketty's lecture invaluable. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cheung. May I now invite the convener of Big Education Platform, Mr. Anthony Leung, to give his opening remarks. Mr. Leung, please.
Good afternoon, Professor Piketty. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank Stephen and Tyler for inviting me to really act as the appetizer to today's lecture. The title of today's lecture is on rising inequality and also globalization. As you know, Hong Kong is the most globalized economy in the world. Clearly we are also the freest economy in the world, as ranked by the Heritage Foundation for the last 20-odd years. Hong Kong is also a place where we have quite a bit of wealth inequality. Our Gini coefficient was 0.539 in 2016. Now, obviously, after the tax and the transfer payments, the Gini coefficient was 0.473, which is still high by world standard. But as many of you know, in Hong Kong, we actually don't talk a lot about the inequality, particularly in the policy circle. We care more about, firstly, economic growth, because economic growth, we believe, with a rising tide, it will correct a lot of ills. And secondly, we talk about social mobility, because when we were talking about this in the government, inequality is bound to exist. And especially in Hong Kong, many of the people, including young people, would see the more successful people as their role model. So we talk about how do we ensure that there will be growth as well as social mobility. Partly maybe because in Hong Kong we do not have direct election. And when we talk about social mobility, we emphasize a lot on education, and this is really the kind of role that I'm representing. I'm convener of the big education platform, and I used to be the chairman of the Education Commission. So, and as you know, we Chinese place a lot of importance on education. And we expanded the opportunity in education a lot. As you know, about 20% of our young people have the university places, and we increased also the postgraduate places. And then since 1997, we increased the total amount of tertiary education to more than 60% of the youth cohort. So it worked well because the formula was if you study well and you have good grades, then you can get a good job. And with hard work, then chances are you'll be successful and you have wealth. And that was the formula. It still worked well. As you know, Hong Kong, we have very low unemployment. Unemployment is less than 3%. We have good growth, particularly now that we have the Greater Bay Area, the One Belt, One Road, as well as the renminbi internationalization. You'll get Hong Kong a lot of growth, except that the social mobility seems to be a problem. And if we look around the world and also look around Hong Kong, there are at least several problems that we are facing that leads to unhappiness and also the doubt on whether this formula will exist. Firstly, technology. Technology is now disrupting the entire world. In addition to giving a lot of opportunities, the disruptive technologies are taking away jobs. There are analysts that talks about half of the world's existing jobs will be displaced by new technology. Secondly, there's the printing of money. Particularly since 2008, when we have the global financial crisis, central banks around the world are printing money. And with the printing of money, it causes what I call the devaluation of paper currency. So those that have assets will see the asset appreciate in at least nominal value. So the so-called capitalists obviously would be wealthier without doing anything. And so with this, particularly also with globalization, the middle class around the world is feeling sinking. Around the world, particularly in US where the data is more available, the middle class income has not really increased in the last 25 years if you take away the price index. In Hong Kong, likewise, if we think about the university graduates, their starting salary actually has not increased in the last 2 decades or so. And then in Hong Kong, there is another problem, and that is because of the mistakes that we had in the previous administrations, we did not produce enough land and we did not produce enough public housing. As a result, private housing is now the most expensive in the world. It's now 19 years of average family or average income to buy an average flat in Hong Kong. The number 2 in the world is Sydney, which is 13 years. By comparison, Singapore is only 5 years. So it causes a lot of discontent in Hong Kong. And then lastly, education itself is also being questioned. Most of the people in Hong Kong, particularly the more educated ones, the more educated parents, are feeling that our education has not really changed in time to cope with the challenges. And also, many would see that good education is not available to everybody. In the past, about 20 years ago, we did an education reform. Obviously, I believe with some success, people would question it. We changed it so that we can change with time, that we are not just focusing on knowledge. But nevertheless, in the last 20 years, we have seen that some policies have changed, and also the world has changed further. The world, as I said in some locations, is going to be a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. There will be a lot of changes that our students will face, and yet our education system is by and large an examination-driven one. which focuses very much on knowledge. And knowledge, nowadays we emphasize a T-shaped knowledge, but knowledge is probably not the most important. The most important would be attributes such as and including creativity, teamwork, leadership skills, grit, humility when you're winning, self-confidence and self-control. And also very importantly, we would like the students to have positive values. Unfortunately, both attributes and values are not quite successfully learned through examinations or textbooks. And that's why the Education 21, a group that I led, about 17 people, published a paper on a different kind of education, basically different from the examination-driven. Now, I'm not going to talk about that in great detail because you can go to the website. And since I only have 3 minutes and I believe I passed the time, I'll just advertise that on the 20th of this month, there will be a forum organized by Education 2.1, where the chief executive will be speaking on. They will talk about education. So I welcome you to go to the conference to see how we can change our education so that it will still allow social mobility, so that the people in Hong Kong, with the positive opportunities that our country is presenting to us, can actually move up both the income as well as the wealth ladder, and reduces not so much the inequality, but reduces the social discontent that we're facing in Hong Kong. So with that as an appetite, I'll actually look forward to Professor Piketty's presentation to see how Hong Kong can really benefit from his work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Leung.
I'm very glad to talk today about rising inequality and globalization, especially in Hong Kong, which is at the same time a place and a city with a lot of inequality, of course, maybe in some ways one of the most unequal in the world. And at the same time, there's something very special with Hong Kong, is that this is maybe the only country in the world that has become a lot more unequal after it has joined a communist country, which is really quite an achievement. And so this makes, really Hong Kong a special place to talk about rising inequality and globalization. So here is what I'm going to do in this presentation. I'm going to show you two different kind of results coming from two different research that are related, of course. The first I will show you some results from the World Inequality Report 2018, which is a report that we have published at the Paris School of Economics earlier this year, which is the joint work of over 100 researchers in the world, covering over 70 countries. And so we have extended series on global inequality. And I'm going to show you some results showing some of the change in inequality and showing the importance of politics and political change and political institution and policies in explaining downturn and upturn in inequality. So if you want to see the full report, just go online, you will get everything. And then the second part of the talk, which I'm going to show you some results coming from a more recent research looking at changing political cleavages, in particular in three countries, the US, the United Kingdom, and France. But this is a research program that's currently being extended to more countries, including outside the West, in Brazil, in India, in South Africa, trying to understand how the political cleavages and the change in political cleavages can explain the evolution of inequality, and in particular the lack of political response to rising inequality. And in particular, I will show you new series documenting the shift from what you can call a class-based political conflict in the 50s, 60s to what can be described as a multiple elite or identity-based political conflict today. And that's something I've been working a lot recently, and I want to show you some new results. I should say, generally speaking, these two strands of research are trying to extend research on inequality in new directions, and basically I'm trying to address some of the key shortcomings that are in my book, Capital in the 21st Century, which contributed to develop the global debate on inequality, but is really a book that has a lot of limitations, I should say. In particular, I should apologize for the fact that it's too much Western-centered, largely because of lack of access to proper historical data in other parts of the world. But in the end, this is a strong limitation of the book, which we're trying to address in the World Inequality Report. I will show you some series on China and India, but still too limited in a way that's too limited. And one other big shortcoming of my book, Capital in the 21st Century, is that I don't open the black box of politics and political cleavages as much as I should, and the second part is trying to address that. So, we are trying to make progress in our understanding of inequality trends. We know a little bit more than we used to, but of course we still know too little, and so this is just a work in progress. So let me start right away by showing you a first graph from the World Inequality Report, where, as you can see, so this is a simple inequality indicator, which is the share of total income going to the top 10% of the population. So by definition, if you had full equality, it should be 10%, because that's 10% of the population. If you had full inequality, it should be 100%. So by definition, it will always be between 10 and 100. The question is where is it between 10 and 100, and how it changes over time. So here you can see that it can move quite a lot. So in particular, it used to be very low in communist countries, in particular in Russia. Now, that doesn't mean this was an equal country, of course. This is about monetary inequalities. There are other forms of inequality. Okay, so if you can't access certain shops, or if you are sent directly to certain jails or whatever, this is certainly a form of inequality that matters a lot, and to some extent a lot more than monetary inequality. So let me be very clear about this. These are indicators of monetary inequality. By definition, communist countries, at least, I'm not including China in this group, or, whatever reform, China and Soviet-type communist countries sort of tried to get rid of monetary inequality, created all other sorts of inequalities. That's another issue. Now, the inequality has increased a lot in these countries, Russia and China, partly because it started from very low level, of course. So all increase in inequality are not necessarily bad. Now, that doesn't mean that all increase in inequality are necessarily good, of course. And so the huge increase that you have in Russia has a lot to do with capture of natural resources and company ownership by private individuals who, frankly, did not contribute that much to anything in many cases. So, inequality sometimes is too low, and inequality sometimes is too high. And, Russia is an example of a very rapid transition to pretty extreme inequality. If you look at China, I should say the increase in inequality is more moderate than in Russia, more moderate than in India. Now, it could be that we understate this. I should say one of the problems that we've had with China is the lack of transparency in data that is really more than problematic. There's a government in Beijing which claims to be fighting corruption, but it's very difficult to know the number of taxpayers for different income brackets. There is an income tax in China, in principle, in the law. But if you want to know how it operates year after year, how many taxpayers between 1 million and 2 million yuan, 2 million and 5 million, I'm not asking for the name. I just want to know how many of them in each part of China. It's impossible to know. So sometimes we do have limited data, which we use for this estimate. This is probably an understatement of the rise in inequality. But I think the only way to improve it, and one of the ways to fight corruption and improve the working of the tax system in China and everywhere in the world, is to have more transparency so that citizens and groups all over the countries can see how many taxpayers are being paid, are being assessed this level of income from year to year. And if there are too few people in the top brackets, well, you'll have to improve the tax administration, or at least there will be some indicators so that people can see what's happening. And the point is that in China at this stage we are really unable to see very much. Now, the case of Hong Kong is so I should apologize that I'm not going to be able to show Hong Kong on this graph. Well, here I've shown very large countries. Now, it's not because Hong Kong is a smaller population that I don't show it. It's because we actually don't have the data. So for Hong Kong, there is data coming from the wage tax, which shows a very big increase in inequality, sort of maybe more closer to the US than to China, if I was to compare on this graph for the recent 2 decades, 20, 25 years. But this is only one part of what's going on, because you can also have business income, capital income can be very important. And for this, unfortunately, in Hong Kong, the tax system does not allow us to know the evolution of top business income, top capital income in China. So in Hong Kong. So I'm sorry, I cannot say more, because the data is just not there. But in any case, what you see here is that you have a pretty big increase in inequality pretty much everywhere, but with different speed across country. And that's what's interesting, because this means that different policies, different institutions, different political trend can actually make a difference. There are countries, I've not shown you Brazil or the Middle East, which will be even higher, 60, 70% for the top 10%. So, that's it's getting close to 80, 90, 100%. So this can go even, this could go even higher. There's no natural law where it should stop. So these are serious evolution. This shows that inequality can change a lot over time, and we want to better understand why. So one way to better understand why is to take a even longer run perspective. So this is the same graph as before, but taking at Europe, US, Japan, and taking a longer run perspective. Now, I cannot do that for all other parts of the world, because I don't always have the historical data for so long. But you can see that for US, Europe, and Japan, we had a pretty high inequality level at the beginning of the 20th century. You have a big decline during the first half of the 20th century. You have a stabilization during the 50s, 60s, 70s at a historically lower level. And then you have a big increase starting around the 1980s, but much bigger in the US than in Europe, in Japan. So we want to understand this, because sometimes people in the US say, well, that's because of globalization. Sometimes they say it's because of China, so let's do something with China, let's go to war with China. Okay, except that Japan, Germany, Sweden are also in globalization, and they don't have the same increase in inequality. So at some point, you cannot blame globalization, you cannot blame China, you cannot blame, there's always someone to blame for. In France, we like to blame Germany, people. So, but, the problem is not to blame others. The problem is to find solution. And when you see this rise in inequality, the first thing to notice is that there are very different magnitude across areas, so different policies can make a difference. So let's try to understand which policy. So one example of such policy is education, of course, and I'm going to come to education in a minute, and I will talk more also about education in terms of its impact on the structure of political cleavages. And I think the rise of higher education, which is, of course, a very good thing in general, and is one of the key solutions to reduce inequality in the future, has also transformed the structure of political conflict in a way that explains partly today the lack of political response to rising inequality. I will come back to this later in the talk. Now, apart from education, there are many other areas of policy that can explain rising and changes in inequality over time. So one example is the progressivity of the tax system. So if you look at this, so this is a brief history of income tax progressivity in US, UK, Germany, France, Japan. So this is the top income tax rate. This is the top rate applying to the highest income in the country. So you can see 1 century ago, there was no income tax, basically, or very little income tax, and many people thought around 1900, 1910 that, okay, there was a lot of inequality at the time, very high level of inequality, so there was a need for income taxation in a way, and in the end, this is what happened. But many people were saying, well, it will never happen. Many people in 1900, 1910, in particular in the US, it was very complicated to make it happen because they had to change the US Constitution, which is very complicated to do. But still this happened. The US Constitution was changed in 1913, very complicated. You need 2/3 of the states to approve the change. It happened. And not only it happened, but in a space of a few years, you can see the US federal government, getting to a top income tax rate, the order of 90% or 80% or more. If you take the average between 1930 and 1980, so half a century, on average, the top income tax rate in the US was 82%. Sometimes it was 91, sometimes it was 70, like in the 70s, right before Reagan, but take the average, 82. Okay? This is only the federal income tax. Okay? You also had state income tax going from 5 to 10, depending on whether you're in Texas, in New York. Here I'm just looking at the federal. Now, apparently, this did not destroy American capitalism. It lasted for half a century, and if anything, productivity growth in the US between 1950 and 1980 was actually higher than what it has been since the 1980s. Okay. Why is it so? Well, probably because these very top rates were applied to very, very high income, say above $1 million of today in annual income. And my reading of the evidence, if you go, company by company, and what's the impact of performance of paying people 10 million rather than 1 or 50 rather than 10, well, my reading of the evidence is actually it's not very useful. Okay? And that when you put essentially a cap on very top income, because this is what you do when you have a top income tax rate of 80 or 90%, you reduce inequality. So I think this policy contributed, in the very high progressivity of the middle of the 20th century did contribute to the fact that this was the lowest inequality period. So in a way, it worked. And on the other side, when it was reduced very strongly, so you can see, US and UK have been also the countries that have changed a lot their policy. In particular, the US, they have been playing a yo-yo with their reach over the 20th century. They've gone very, very far in the direction of extreme progressivity and then very, very far in the other direction. France, Germany, Japan were sort of more stable, partly because part of the redistribution in the middle of the 20th century in these three countries was done through destruction, through war, through inflation. So I tend to prefer progressive taxation, which I think is a more civilized manner than, someone was referring to money creation a minute ago. Money creation, sometimes can reinforce inequality, and it's not necessarily a very good way to reduce inequality. So I tend to prefer progressive taxation. So this is progressive taxation of income. This is progressive taxation of wealth, inherited wealth. So you can see again, UK, US, and Japan, to a large extent, went to very, very high top rate. So this is for very large billionaires who transmit their wealth. Okay? So right now, in Hong Kong, the tax rate as inheritance is exactly 0%, which I would argue is a bit too small, 0%. And in China, in mainland China, it's also 0%. So basically, if you want to die in Asia and transmit your wealth, if you are Donald Trump and you want to transmit your wealth, you should die in China. This is the place to go for a real capitalist. Okay? If you go to Japan, look what happened. If you go to Taiwan, communist Taiwan, you pay inheritance tax. So if you go to Korea, you also pay an inheritance tax. So you should go to communist China or Hong Kong, or at least countries ruled by the Communist Party of China. This is the place. This is the place to transmit private wealth. Now, this is an incredible situation, isn't it? No, I mean, this is an interesting situation, okay? So what I want you to remember from this is that you have a lot of talk about the fact that we cannot introduce inheritance taxation, that progressive taxation is very dangerous for economic incentives, etc. And then you have the reality, which is history, which is our common legacy. And I think one, takeaway from reality and from the history of capitalism is that you can have a lot of innovation, a lot of growth, and at the same time have a lot of progressive taxation and reduce inequality. That's perfectly consistent. This is what happened for a long time. Okay, so this is the first dimension of policy I wanted to talk about. Now, progressive taxation is not going to solve all problems. It can reduce inequality at the top, it can raise tax revenue, but then if you really want to reduce inequality, you'll have to do education, you'll have to do labor market policy. So in particular, if you want to explain the evolution in the US, what's really striking in the US is the collapse of bottom incomes. So this is the share of total national income in the US going to the top 1% and bottom 50% over the past 30 years. And you have a complete collapse of the share going to bottom 50%. And so how far will it go? So this is before tax. Now if you look at after tax and transfer, it will be a bit higher for the bottom 50%, but actually in monetary income, it will not make a big difference. You will need to take the in-kind health transfer to increase it a little bit, but this partly reflects the increase in the income of the doctors and pharmaceutical companies more than the welfare of the poor in the US. So it's complicated, to assess the rise of health costs in the US. In any case, what people want is to have jobs and wages. So in a way, what matters is the primary distribution. And when you have the share of the bottom 50%, going from 20 to 10. I mean, 20 was already not a lot as compared to 10% for just 1% of the population. But now it's even, twice as low as the share going to the top 1%. So what this means is that rising inequality, has taken a magnitude that is, it's not just about symbolic problems. It's not just, if it was simply a few, football players who are giving us a good show and who are making a lot of money, as long as this is a good show and this does not matter from a macroeconomic viewpoint, who cares? But here, the price of the show is getting high. We are talking not of a symbolic, okay? We are talking of the share of national income going from 10 to 20. And if you look at the, which is the same as the collapse in the bottom 50%. So we're talking about a lot of money. And this is a time period also, if growth in the US had been Chinese growth, 8% per year, after all, you will still have growth for the bottom 50%. But with a growth of 1.5, 2% per year in per capita terms, in fact, this means that this collapse in bottom 50% means a complete stagnation or even a small fall in the real value of the bottom 50% average income. And I think this does contribute to the anger of a lot of low-paid Americans. And in the end, this does contribute to the rise of what we see today and this, sort of this game of blaming other people for the problem, which I think is certainly not the solution. But this has big consequences for all of us. Now, I should say that the data we have for Hong Kong, just using the wage tax data, which I'm not going to show you today because it's incomplete data, and we'd like to have access to more data. But this is work that was done by Regina Ung, which is a student from Hong Kong who was doing her master at Paris School of Economics last year. And she finds evolution of top 1% and bottom 50% share of Hong Kong over the same period, which is very comparable in a way that what we have to the US. So I'm not going to show it to you today because it's still, the data is imperfect. We are not sure. We're waiting to have a more satisfactory estimate to release it. But from what we see, in Hong Kong, I think that there is a serious problem, not only of very high income at the top, but of a collapse in the share going to the bottom. Now, what can we do about this collapse at the bottom? Well, of course, one key issue is education. Now, education, I'm going to show you a graph about access to higher education in the US. So this is, on the horizontal axis, you have parental income rank, and on the vertical axis, you have the probability to go to college, university in the US sense. So this is for kids who were in college 2012 to 2015, so this is really almost today, okay? Now, this is data that was computed by my friends Raj Shetty, Emmanuel Saez, which was not available when I wrote my book, so I could not include that kind of data in my book. If you go to their Equality of Opportunity Project website, you will find all the details, all the data sources, the computer code, the detailed everything. Okay? So here I'm just describing the basic result. So what you see is really quite frightening, I think, because what you see is, you almost have a, it's almost the 45-degree line. It's as if, not quite, when you don't go from 0 to 100, when you're really poor, when your parents are really poor, you still have a 20% chance to go to college. And when your parents are very rich, you only have a 95% chance to go to college. Okay, so it doesn't go from 0 to 100, but it's very close. Now, that's important because, in fact, this is an understatement of inequality of access to education because the people at the top who go to college, they go to very well-funded private universities, whereas people at the bottom, they go to community college that are underfunded in the US, which, Obama tried to increase funding, but, this is largely a state responsibility in the US. So in the end, inequality of access to higher education is even bigger. Now, when you see that kind of graph, I think what's important to realize is sometimes there is such a huge gap, between the official discourse about meritocracy, equal opportunity, blah, 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 and the reality of what we have, okay? So we all like, or many people like to talk about the US as the land of opportunity, et cetera, but, the reality of what we have, has just little to do with the theoretical claim. And so I think it's important to have more transparency, not only in China, but also in the US, in Europe, and more transparency not only about income tax return, but also access to public services and who has access to what kind of educational investment people are getting. So again, I don't know what the graph would look like in Hong Kong. Maybe it will be less extreme as this. And maybe we actually don't even know. And I think in itself, this is a problem. the fact that we don't know, because I think it's important. You know, if we want to take this seriously, we need to have targets. We need to say, okay, are we happy with this? What's our target? How are we going to improve it? How are we going to collectively be able to monitor it from year to year? What kind of policy? So, you know, most of the time, you know, many people, in particular those who benefit from the economic system, you know, tend to not to spend too much time, you know, checking whether the reality of the claims about meritocracy, equal opportunity are actually true. So I think it's important to bring more transparency to this debate. The last piece of change in policies that I would like to mention much more quickly is also policies about privatization, public debt, etc. So more on the macro side, which I think are also important for inequality. You know, it's not only about the micro side and education, taxation, which is very important. Minimum wage is very important. You know, I should say in the fall of bottom wages in the US, the complete fall in the real value of the minimum wage over the past 30 years is an important. So you cannot get everything from the minimum wage. You also need to increase education, productivity, so that people can take high-paying jobs. But you don't want the minimum wage to fall behind as it happened in the US over the past 30 years. Now, this is a graph that tells you something about the evolution of privatization, public debt, and public wealth in general. Okay, so this is the share of net public wealth in national wealth. So start with China, because that's easy enough to understand. China used to be communist, as you know. Now, if we look at the share of net public wealth in China, it's actually less than 50%, so about 30%. Now, what are we talking about? So this is the share of every asset that can be owned and traded in China. So this includes housing, companies, agricultural land. So this 30% that you have today for China means basically that this is an average of, in housing, it is less than 10% that is now owned by the Chinese government. But in the company sector, it's more 50%. So basically, 30 should be thought as an average between 10 and 50, if I want to simplify. Now, the interesting point is that this has stabilized since the financial crisis. So this has stabilized at about 30%. If you look now at Western countries, what you see is a huge decline over time. Now, this comes from what? Well, if you have an increase in public debt and a decline in public assets, in particular through privatization and less investment in public infrastructure, then your net public wealth goes down. Now, in the US, UK, these are the two countries where actually it has become negative. You know, it's interesting. When I published my book in 2013, the only Western country where it was negative was Italy, which I have not shown here. And today, well, you also have the UK and the US. So what does it mean, negative? Well, it means that the public debt is bigger than the public assets. So it means that even if you sell all the schools, all the hospitals, all the public buildings, and you start paying rent from the people who own the school, the hospital, in order to send your children to the school and the hospital, that will not be enough to repay the public debt. Now, I'm not saying we should do that, but it's important to realize that when we pay interest on the public debt, it's like paying rent to the owners of the schools to which we send our children. Well, so we don't see it because it goes through the financial intermediation system, and sometimes we have the illusion that interest rates are low, partly because we've created a lot of money, which is not necessarily good from a distributional perspective for other reasons, so it's partly artificial, and this may not last forever. But in the end, you know, negative net public wealth, you know, I don't know what's the optimum. I'm not saying 30% in China is the optimum, and I think, you know, it all depends on the kind of governance system that you have for your public sector, and I would not argue that the governance system for this huge public sector in China is the best you can have. You know, I think more sharing of power, more role for worker representative, union representative. You know, there are lots of things that could be said on how you manage the public sector. And 30%, you know, you could argue it's too high. You could argue it's 20%. It's interesting to see that up until the 70s and basically between the 50s and 70s, which was sort of the mixed economic period in the West, the share of net public wealth was around 20, 30%. So it's a bit smaller than China today, but not completely different. Okay? So I don't know what's the optimum. Maybe it's not 30, maybe it's 20, maybe it's 10, but all I want you to remember is that a negative is really very small. Okay? And if you continue like this, you know, more and more negative public wealth, in the end, this is a strong limitation of the ability of the government to invest in infrastructure to solve major problems like global warming. You know, you can always solve a public debt problem because in the end, this is a private contract. You know, we are not being owned by the Mars planet. You know, we are being owned by each other. It's just so you can change it from one day to the other. Global warming, you know, it could be more complicated when you have 3 degrees too much. So that's part of the big picture. Now, let me try to get to, the politics of this. Why is it, that you don't have this political response to rising inequality? You could think, okay, maybe, rising inequality should lead to rising demand. So one possible explanation, which people very often put forward, and which I think is part of the explanation, is that globalization and competition between countries make it much more difficult than it used to be to organize vertical redistribution. And indeed, if you take an extreme view that the only thing that the modern nation state can do is to control borders, then political conflict will be entirely about border control. Yes, by assumption. Okay, so that's and in a way that's a little bit what's happening. So border controls, this can be for migrants, this can be for trade, different kind of borders. But basically, if you make this assumption that you cannot do any vertical redistribution anymore, take the extreme case where you assume anybody with more than average income can put his money to tax haven at zero cost and pay no tax. If you're willing to make this assumption, yes, indeed, all you're going to be fighting for in politics is border control. Now, we are not quite at this situation. I think it's largely an ideological construction, but certainly globalization, which has all sorts of good aspects on other dimensions, because of the lack of proper coordination on fiscal issues, regulation issues, has contributed to this evolution. Now, this is a bit too mechanical because, in fact, globalization could be organized differently. So what I will argue, I'm going to present you some results on what I will call the Brahmin left and the merchant right, and I will explain you why I use these terms to describe the changing political conflict in the West. But the basic idea here is that unequal globalization at the end is a choice. So it must be that some groups believe that the system is working fine as it is, and the benefits of competition between countries in the end are more important than the cost. Otherwise, it's not so complicated, to renegotiate a number of trade treaties or sign new form of trade treaties where, in addition to some forms of regulated free trade, you also have coordinated taxation of multinationals, exchange of information about financial assets. It's not technically, it's not very complicated. So it must be that there are some political reasons why we don't see it, and this is what I want to talk more about today. So I'm going to present, if we want to better understand the future of inequality, the future of redistribution, I will argue that we need to first to better understand the changing structure of political ideological conflict. So this is more, we are moving from economics to political science here in a way. But I think we need to be pluridisciplinary if we want to understand this dynamics. And I will argue that we actually know very little about the changing structure of political conflict. And so what I do in this paper, and you will have all the details online if you want, I built long-run series on changing political cleavages in order to try to make some limited progress in this direction. So today I will present you some results for France, US, Britain. This is currently being extended to many other countries, which I will not have time to show you today. But just keep in mind, it's not that I am obsessed with US, UK, Britain, US, UK, France. US, UK, Britain will be a bit too much. But it's just that for these three countries, we have very long historical series in terms of post-electoral survey, in particular, quite high-quality post-electoral survey. These are three interesting Western democracies to look at. But of course, more countries are to be studied. So the main empirical finding, which I'm going to present to you now, is what I call the rise of multiple elite politics. So here is basically what I mean by that. In the 50s, 60s, the vote for Labour Party in Britain, Socialist, Communist Party in France, Democratic Party in the US, although these different parties had very different historical origin in the three countries, they had a lot of in common in the sense that they were mostly educated, mostly associated with lower education, lower income, lower wealth voters. So if you take all of these dimensions, which are never perfectly correlated, some people have low education, high wealth, so, there is some correlation, but it's never one, hopefully. But whatever this dimension you take, in the 50s, 60s, when you're at the bottom, you tend to vote for one party or political coalition, and when you're at the top, you vote for the other. So this is what I call a sort of class-based political conflict. I'm not saying class-based political conflict is necessarily good, but it tends to come with a lot of discussion about redistribution, and I will argue that this was associated to the rise of New Deal policies in the US, social democratic welfare state policy in Britain and France. So at least this came together with a political conflict that was more centered on inequality redistribution than what we have today. And what we have today is something very different. What I will show you is that this structure of the political conflict has changed, and in particular the vote for Labour, Socialist, Democratic Party, which you can call left if you want, but I should say, the whole purpose of this research is to try to redefine what left or right means and to see that this changes a lot over time. And one way to study how this changes over time is to look at who votes for whom, because I think, usually this is a good indicator of at least how voters perceive the different parties to defend them or not to defend them. And so you can always say voters did not understand me, but if they don't understand you for 50 consecutive years, at some point, I think the problem is more with the message and with the people who hear the message. So here, that's the point of view, is to look at the transformation of who votes for whom in order to better understand how the kind of program and coalition of interest as perceived by the voters has changed over time. And so we will see that the vote for Labour, Socialist Democratic Party has gradually become associated since the 70s, 80s with higher education voter, giving rise since the 1990s, 2000, to what I propose to call a multiple elite party system, where high education elite vote for the left, high income, high wealth elite vote for the right. And I think, this probably contribute to explain, what we call today the rise of populism. Well, I think, because of this multiple elite party system, it could be that if one coalition is more associated to high education, the other with high income, people who are at the bottom in all dimensions, could just feel completely left behind by this kind of structure of political conflict. And this could explain partly the rise of populism, which I think can only be properly understood if we look at the rise of elitism, so to speak. So I think this evolution corresponds to a gradual decomposition of the post-war party system. I will argue that the rise of globalization and the rise of the conflict about migration or international trade can be part of, in particular, the conflict about migration or different racial identities in the case of the US and more migration in Europe, can be part of the explanation for this evolution, but it's not the only part, and maybe not the most important part. And I will say the rise of tertiary education and the fact that some of the people who managed to make it to tertiary education tend to look down to the people who did not make it is maybe an even bigger part of the explanation, and that's what I will try to push. So here is the kind of graph that I'm going to show you. So this is for France, and I will show you that it's very much the same for US and for UK. So what do we have here? We have the difference between the percentage of university graduate voters voting for left, so here this will mean Socialist Communist Party in the case of France, and non-university voter voting for left. So when it's negative, it means that university graduates vote more for the right and less for the left. So initially, we had a situation where people with primary education will vote more for the left, Socialist Communist Party. Now you can see over time this has transformed completely, so I will show you more detailed data, but this is to give you a preview. Now this is for the US with the Democratic Party. After controlling for other factors, so after controlling for age, for education, for income, for wealth, it's the same whether you put the raw data or you include the control. This is with the Labour Party in UK. Now, my preferred graph, I think what is the most comparable is to look for each time at a fixed fraction of the population with the highest level of education. The problem here is that, of course, the number of people with university education has increased a lot over time. In fact, when you try to take a fixed fraction of the population with the highest level of education, it's even more spectacular because at the end of the period, the higher you are, the PhD or the master vote more for Democratic Party, for Hillary Clinton rather than Donald Trump. So in fact, when you take the fixed percentage, this is what you get. It's even more. So here, this is the top 10% education voter versus bottom 90% education voter. So you can see that the three countries have very similar evolution. Britain is sort of lagging behind a little bit, and I will come back to this, but in the end, it's the same evolution. France and US are very similar evolution, which in itself is not obvious at all, because the historical origin of the party system are very different. Okay, the Socialist Communist Party in France, as compared to the Democratic Party in the US, which used to be the party of slavery, then became the party of the New Deal, now has become something else, and it's so very, very different historical origin, but in the end, a common starting point in the 50s in sort of basic structure of who votes for whom, and a very similar evolution. So that's what we are going to try to understand a bit better. I guess I'm going to accelerate at some point, because it's, I have planned a ridiculously large number of slides, which of course I will not show everything. And so, the presentation, you can, someone maybe will put it online, or, it's very, anybody who wants to see it, that's actually, it's already online, I think, on my personal webpage. So have a look. But from now on, I'm going to have to accelerate. I'm sure someone at some point will show me some minute when I'm really... But here is what I'm going to try to do. Okay, I'm going to try to present you the results for France, then US, then Britain. And then I will try to keep some time for open questions about the future and what does it say about the future of the political structure of election. So let me start with France, because after all we are in a lecture about French culture, so I assume you are a bit interested in France. So in France, we have this long tradition of post-electoral survey, which I'm going to use. So you have typically about 4,000 observations. So post-electoral survey are surveys where you ask people detailed questions about how they voted, and also what's your income, what's your wealth, what's your property, what's your education. The good thing about the French post-electoral survey, they start in the 1950s. In US and Britain, they start a bit earlier in the late 40s. But the good thing about France is that you have very detailed questions about asset ownership. In the UK also to some extent, but in US they don't ask, which is a pity, because in fact we're going to see that wealth is the strongest predictor of vote than income. Okay, so I will look both at presidential election and legislative election. So presidential election in France, they start in 1965 with De Gaulle Mitterrand. Well, there was one in 1848, but it ended up badly because the winner decided to become an emperor, and which is the reason why there was no more presidential election for more than a century. And finally, De Gaulle came in 58 and 62 with a referendum, and in 65 he managed to get an election with universal suffrage. He thought he will vote very easily, but in the end, the second round, 55 to 45 with Mitterrand, was quite tight. You see that it's usually been quite tight, except in election when you have the extreme right at the second round, which we had in 2017 and 2002, which I don't show here, which gives results that you can imagine for the political cleavage, and that I can answer in questions if you want. Now, I will also use data from the legislative election, because legislative election in France are much older. They have been held every 5 years since roughly every 5 years since 1871 with universal suffrage. So we have a much longer time period. So we have a lot of political parties in France. In France, this is a national sport to create new parties all the time. So this happens on the left. This happens even more so on the right, when you have MRP, CNIP, UNR, RPR, UDF, UMP. And people create new parties all the time. So this is very different from Britain, where you have Labour, Conservative, or US, where you have Republican, Democrat. But in the end, people recognize them. They change their name, but voters sort of know who they are. And so in the end, I will argue, if you want to do a detailed analysis of political representation in France, of course you want to distinguish all these different parties. But today, because I want to compare to two-party system like UK, US, I will put them together. Okay? In the paper, you will see a detailed result by parties, but it's actually interesting to see that in the end, if you put them together, you have very similar evolution to US, UK, where you have different tendency within the Republican Party or within the, well, certainly the Conservative Party in Britain recently, has given us some evidence that there is a lot of disagreement. It's also within the Labour Party, of course. So in France, it takes a different institutional form of having multiple parties, but in the end, you also have disagreement in right and left coalition in other. So anyway, I'm going to show you a key finding will be a basic reversal of the educational cleavage. So what I will show you is that, if you look at the beginning of the period, the more educated, the more vote for the right, as defined in the previous graph. At the end of the period, the more educated, the more you vote for the left. And then I will put some control. Forget about the equation if you don't like them. It's just a way to control for age, control for sex, so to look at the residual effect of education or income or whatever. So that's the basic result I have shown you. In fact, it's even more spectacular. If you look, so let me show you 4 elections to begin with. At the beginning of the period, you see that the fraction voting for socialist communist declines regularly. You know, when you have a primary education, 57% of the people vote for the left. Then higher education, 37%. Then at the end of the period, this is the opposite. You know, so 2012, this is Hollande against Sarkozy. Then it's completely different. You know, the more educated you have, the more you vote for the Socialist Party. Okay, so you have a complete change. At the same time as you have an increase in the fraction of people with higher education. So look at, in 1956, you have actually 72% of the electorate which has only primary education. So many of them, you know, their children have become educated. So some of them have high education, some of them are secondary education, some of them are still primary education. Now, most of them had parents or grandparents who had primary education by definition, but the interesting thing is that only those who made it to higher education still vote for the left. Those who have stayed at the primary or secondary, they are not so convinced by the left. So why is it so? So that's the thing. Okay, you have educational expansion, which is good, certainly. You know, we are not going to disagree about this here. But educational expansion has also come with a complete reversal of how people associate themselves to parties. Now, these are only 4 elections, but if you look, all the elections at the beginning, it was, you know, declining, 56, 58, 62, 65. All the elections at the end are rising. So, you know, it's very striking. If you put all elections at the same time, so here I have put together all legislative elections and all presidential elections. So you see at the beginning of the period, it was always declining, so the vote for left parties. And in the middle, it's sort of, you know, changing side. And at the end, it's clearly upward. So this is even stronger if I decompose between long higher education and short higher education, which I cannot do for the full period. But here, starting in 1973, I can see, so long higher education will be people with master degree, PhD, or a grande école degree in the French context, whereas short higher education will be people with 2-year degree or 3-year degree and nothing more. Okay. Now you can see at the beginning of the period, you know, in 1973, students from grande école, they actually vote for the right. You know, the idea that students are always left, but it's completely wrong. You know, as well, they may be left when they are 20, but once they get to 30 or 35, you know, they are right at the time. And so they vote for the right. I don't know if they were right, but anyway, that's what they did. Whereas at the end of the period, you know, you have this trend. So, you know, here, one way to summarize the evolution is to look at the difference between university graduate and non-university graduate, but it's actually a much more general than that. You know, no matter how you slice the data, whether you compare primary with secondary, secondary with higher, you break down secondary, you really move from a curve that slopes in one direction to a curve that slopes in the other direction. This is statistically significant, so you know the sample size is limited, so don't pay too much attention to the small year-to-year variation. With this kind of data, unfortunately, you cannot really look at the small year-to-year variation. Okay, sample size does not allow you to do that. But the long-run evolution is perfectly significant. If you control for age and sex, this does not change much. Okay, you could say, well, this is because, you know, the young people have more education and the young people vote on the left. But as I said, this is not so strong. And in fact, this has always been like that. Okay, so indeed, if you control for age, you can see that the people with high education vote a bit less for the left, but you know it's only a bit less, and it was already like this at the beginning. So they were already younger, and they already voted a bit more for the left. So that's not the explanation. There's really a structural change. You control for sex, income, wealth. It goes the other way. It pushes the level a bit upwards because now controlling for income, you know, more income tends to be a bit more right-wing. So controlling for income. When you have more education, this makes you even more left. I mean, the people who vote for the most left at the end will be people with very high education and zero income. That will be the most extreme. If you control for father's occupation, sorry, I don't have mother's occupation for the full survey, so it's not a choice. But anyway, that doesn't change the evolution. So this is very striking. Here I look at top 10% versus bottom 90%. I could look at top 50% versus bottom 50%. You know, no matter how you slice the data, you get this quite clear evolution. Now let's compare to the evolution we have for income. Now what's striking is that, in fact, you don't have the same evolution for income. You have it a little bit, but it's still the case today that top income, and in particular top wealth group, vote more for the right, or the parties that are not on the left. So this is first, okay, this is the relation between income and vote. So you can see that in France, okay, the top income groups, historically, they don't like the left too much. Look, in 1962 or 1978, it goes down. At the end of the period, they like the left a bit more, but they still don't like it too much. In the bottom 90%, there's actually not a strong relation between income and vote. That's because income, I will argue, is a combination of many different things. Well, first, it's a combination of education and wealth, but it depends on, for instance, if you work in agriculture, you can have a low income, but you don't like the left too much for all sorts of good reasons, in particular in the French context. So that's why, in the end, you have these counteracting factors which make it look flat at the bottom. Now, if you look at wealth, so I'm going to show you the same relation with wealth. So here you can see the relation is much more striking. So, if you have a lot of wealth, you really don't like the Socialist Communist Party too much. And if you have no wealth at all, you don't like the right-wing parties too much. Okay, it's a much stronger predictor, and this has remained still strong. This is a bit less strong today, but it has remained still strong. So if we summarize what we have, so this is a graph where I try to summarize what we have for education. We have a complete reversal of the situation, but for income and wealth, so I have put a dashed line for the 2017 election, which is complicated to interpret, and I think which is a sign of a very unstable situation with a multidimensional political conflict. Remember in France in 2017, there were 4 candidates in the first round who had between 20 and 24% of the vote. So basically, statistically, almost any 2 of the 4 could have made it to the second round. So it's very, very unstable and very unusual situation. Usually, in a 2-round system, you would expect the vote to concentrate on top 2 or maybe top 3, but top 4 is pretty unusual. So I have put some dashed line because it's very. So if you put Macron with Mélenchon, Hamon vote versus Fillon, Le Pen vote at the first round, this is what you will get. But it's not clear at all whether these are meaningful coalitions to look like and whether this is a stable situation. So that's why I have put dashed line. In any case, even taking into account this last election, you can see that the top income, and in particular top wealth voters, still vote for the right and extreme right more than for the left and extreme left. Okay, so which means that at the beginning of the period, all people at the bottom were voting in the same direction. At the end, you have this kind of multiple elite system where high education people tend to prefer a coalition, but high wealth people, typically people working for Fillon and to some extent Le Pen in the French context, if this rings a bell to you, tend to be high wealth, okay, and not necessarily high education. So that's this is what you have at the end of the period. Now, what's interesting, if you try to understand where this comes from, I would say, the rise of the conflict about migration is certainly very important. But explains part of the division, in particular among the lower education group, those who feel they should still be in favor of openness toward migrants, and those who have been convinced by some politicians that the migrants were their enemies. So I think that's clearly one of the explanations. And indeed, you can see at the end of the period, if I move very fast, something what I find very striking is that if you look at the Muslim vote. So Muslim vote is a very complicated concept, as you can imagine. Here I'm talking of people who report themselves as Muslim. So this is self-reported religion. So in 2012, you have 35% of the voters in France which report themselves as no religion. Only 5% as Muslim. So you have to be registered, and you have to vote. Now you can still see that you have a very significant, 90% vote. So why is it so? Well, probably Muslim voters feel that there is a lot of hostility on the right side, which frankly I can understand. So in the end, what's striking, what I want you to remember is that this 90% vote for the left is something extremely large, and the only comparison where you can make is the black vote for the Democratic Party in the US, where you also get 90%. Okay, but the effect of identity on vote, has taken in Europe. So this is, the difference between percentage Muslim voting left, non-Muslim voting left. You have 40%. So there is a limited number of observations, particularly at the beginning, but that's well enough to be significant. Of course, that's partly because Muslim voters have less income, etc. But even when you put the control, you still have a huge impact, just like for the black vote in the US. So it is more identity than just social class. So the rise of identity politics clearly can be part of the explanation. But what I will argue is that if you look at the evolution, so let me move to US now. If you look at the evolution for France, you will find that this evolution toward multiple elite politics has started before migration really became an issue. And I think it's more reasonable to see the link with changing educational stratification than with migration. So, but let's come back to that in the conclusion. First, let me show you the results for the US. So for the US, I only use presidential elections. So you all know about presidential elections in the US, Kennedy, Nixon, Clinton, Trump, etc. So as you know, Clinton has won the election. I know Trump is pretending the opposite, but that's the numbers we have is that she got 51% of the vote. But well, in any case, this was very close. And so what we are going to do is to compare who votes for these different Republican and Democratic candidates. Now, what's really very striking is that if you take, so the black vote is 90% Democrat, since the 1960s. It was not like that before the civil rights movement. Well, as you know, Democratic Party was the party of slavery. So if you go back to 1900, no black voter will vote Democrat, by definition. But then, after the civil rights movement, it's not that the Republican Party was very much pro-black anyway. But after the civil rights movement, clearly the black voters turned Democrat. In a very striking way, 90% of the vote. So, there would have been no Democrat president if it was elected only with the white vote since the 1960s. Okay, so that's very strong. It's always like that. So, the Trump thing is not new. It has been like that for a long time. If you look at the percentage voting Democrats among black or other minorities versus among whites, you have this huge effect, which we got also for the Muslim vote now in France. The only difference, if you compare the structure of vote in France and the US, it's interesting, in France, so in the recent survey, we actually have questions on, do you have a foreign grandparent? So you have about 30% in France who claim they have a foreign grandparent, which is also what demographers estimate. About 10% have a grandparent outside Europe, mostly North Africa, a little bit Sub-Saharan Africa, a little bit Asia, but not too much. Now, this group vote 80% for the left, whereas the 19% who have a foreign grandparent in Europe, typically these are people who have a grandparent mostly in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal, a little bit in Germany, in Britain, but mostly it's Spain, Italy, Portugal. So these are the French Latinos, if you want, except that the French Latinos, they are not Latinos. They don't perceive themselves as Latinos. They are not perceived as Latinos, and they vote like other people. Whereas in the US, this 20% of Latino vote is sort of intermediate between the two, so which creates a very different situation, of course, for the future. But still, there are some similarities, and there are also some differences. If you look at vote by education, you can see people with a PhD, they don't vote for Trump. Okay, this is not a surprise, but so you have 75% of people with a PhD who vote Hillary Clinton. I don't even know who are the 25% because when you go to US universities, you don't see them. But whatever. So what I mean is that in the US, the education gradient used to be downward sloping. More educated people vote for Republican at the beginning, and now it's upward sloping. The bottom group is really because of a black minority effect. If you control for that, it will be upward sloping all along. Now, let me compare. So this is the evolution of the gradient for France and the US in terms of education, so very, very similar. Now, the difference is that in the US, for the first time with the Trump vote, so let me show you here. So you have a lot of election. All what I want you to remember is that 2016 is the first election ever where the top income voters vote Democrat. Okay? So in other words, for the first time in 2016, you have both the top education and the top income who vote Democrat. So here you seem to have a complete reversal of the political conflict where everybody at the top will vote Democrat. And now, I don't know, nobody knows if this is permanent. You know, it could be that this is just a Trump effect, that once the Republican Party puts someone more reasonable in charge, they will get back the high-income vote for them. But, or not, you know, nobody knows. That's a big open question. Now, let me conclude with Britain, which is interesting because it illustrates another kind of evolution, well, which has some similarities but has some differences as well. So, Britain, let me go very fast. You all know about Britain, you know, Attlee defeated Churchill in 1945, put in place the National Health Service and all sorts of great policies. You know, this is history now. Then you have Thatcher, you have Blair, and the last election, May Corbyn is very close. Sorry for all the liberal and liberal Democrat supporters in the room. I excluded them and looked only at Labour Conservative. They are very small at the beginning of the period, very small at the end. They are sometimes big in the middle, but they create problems. So here I concentrate on Labour Conservative. sorry for the fan supporters of Nick Clegg and other. Anyway, so this is what we get. So the same thing as before. The only difference, let me move very fast. The only difference is this, which is that at the end of the period, so remember for Trump, the high-income people were joining the high-education people. Now, the high-income people don't like Corbyn. Okay, you can see, you know, 2016, 17, in fact, high-income, high-wealth people, they go for the conservative. And so if anything, in UK in recent election, you have a complete split and reinforcing split between high education and high income, high wealth. Of course, Brexit is playing a big role on that. So typically, high education people don't like Brexit too much. High wealth people, you know, I don't know for how long they will like Brexit too much. But anyway, that's right now. This is the split. Now, what this illustrates also, well, maybe they just hate Corbyn more than they hate Brexit. You know, it's a difficult choice for them. And so anyway, that's what this shows is that different party strategy can matter. You know, so that's why, you know, what I have shown you, you know, I think these are not deterministic evolution. In the end, you know, whether you have Corbyn, whether you have Clinton or Sanders, whether you have, and that's, you know, in a few years, if we meet again in a few years, maybe we'll have very different kind of government in the US and in Britain, and we'll have very different views on this. And so this is what I want you to remember from this, is that, you know, these are, we have moved from a simple situation in the post-war period, which we thought was eternal, permanent, but which in fact was really a very specific time period where coalitions were made on class in a way that was really unusually strong in many countries, maybe not all countries, but at least in these three big Western democracies, it was organized along similar lines. And then we've had a complete transformation. I don't know how much time more you want me to talk. Someone was showing me a minute sign, but of course I forgot. 3 minutes, okay. Yes, that's exactly what I need. So this is, so just to summarize the findings, this is for Britain with the Corbyn effect at the end. This is for France with the Macron effect at the end, which is sort of going in a similar way as Trump versus Clinton, but not completely. And this is Trump versus Clinton, where you really have all the elite, if you want, moving toward Clinton, at least as compared to Trump, both in terms of income and in terms of education. Now, if I had wealth for the US, unfortunately, I don't have the wealth data. Maybe I will see that the very high wealth people, on average, still prefer Trump rather than Clinton. Here, I actually don't know. It's actually striking that when you have wealth, you know, in green, it's always below the blue. So, you know, high wealth is always more associated to this right-wing party. So whatever you call this coalition, you know, I don't want to call them really left or right, because in fact their content changes so much over time that it, but they are meaningful coalition in the sense that people just don't vote at random. You know, there is some pattern, but these patterns are changing over time. Let me get yes, I have two big open questions, but let me, you know, two big open questions. Could the transition to a multiple elite system could have happened without the rise of globalization, migration, and can multiple elite system persist, or will the high education, high income, wealth voters unite in the long run? You know, I think, let me jump directly to conclusion, which is sort of summarizing what's in between. What I will argue is that both the rise of globalization, migration, and educational expansion have played a role in this evolution. And let me stop on this for the conclusion. What I mean by educational expansion is that, as long as we were in the era of primary and secondary education, there was a very simple egalitarian educational platform, which is we want to get everybody there. Okay, we want to get everybody at the end of primary, and then we want to get everybody at the end of secondary. Once you enter the world of mass higher education, it's more complicated, because you cannot say, I will get 100% higher education or 100% PhD. Or maybe one day we'll say it, but for a very long time, you have to accept some form of stratification, and that's very difficult, in particular for what used to be the left parties that promoted education, primary, secondary education as one of their key objectives. And I think there's been a tendency of what used to be these left parties, and in particular among those who have been very successful in education, to look down at those who were less successful. And so I think the right policy platform, in my view, will be to have more progressive taxation for top income and wealth group in order to invest more in the community college, in the primary and secondary education of the more disadvantaged social groups, which is really very badly financed, not only in the US, but also in Europe and probably in many other parts of the world as well. I think there's a lot of hypocrisy on the side of the winner of the educational game to pretend that we have achieved educational equality in terms of opportunity, whereas the data I have shown you for the US at the beginning shows that the gap between the official discourse and the reality can be enormous. So we need to measure these things, and I think that will be a way to change this pattern. Otherwise, I think there's a risk that if we move to a sort of nativist versus globalist political conflict, with all the lower social groups being tempted by the nativist vote and ideology in different forms, in different places, and all the more educated, higher income voting for the more globalist party and looking down at all these people for being racist. But this is, I think, very, very frightening in the long run. So it's important to in the US, there's a tendency for the Democratic Party to say, oh, we did everything well with the poor. Why is it that they don't like us? Well, I think they can do better. I think there's a lot of progress that can be made in terms of policy platform in the US, in Europe, in other places. Good news, I think, is that social sciences can help. I think, I hope I have convinced you that constructing historical series, trying to make historical comparison between time period and countries which sometimes don't like to compare to one another and feel that they are exceptional. I see that in my country, in France, the US, the feeling of US exceptionalism is very strong. So sometimes, they only want to hear about the US, they don't want to make comparison. I assume that in China, could be tempted in the future, or maybe right now, with the feeling of exceptionalism and refuse to make a comparison. Well, it's going to be difficult to make comparison with electoral data with China, of course, probably for a long time. But, maybe with Hong Kong data, we could do something. Anyway, let me stop there, and thank you a lot for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that very much like myself, that you find Professor Piketty's presentation as a lecture overwhelming, thought-provoking, and quite honestly, when I was listening to his presentation, and also in the past week, I was reading the edited volume entitled After Piketty. That at the very beginning, I was thinking that, who is that Thomas Piketty, with a title of After Piketty, what really happened, So from now on, if we look at the world in a different way. But after listening to the presentation, I'm sure that probably you will also entertain the idea that perhaps we should also work on a volume like After Piketty in Hong Kong, so that we look at the same issue, never quite the same again. This afternoon, we have a panel with also two distinguished speakers, as well as very influential persons in our community. On my left is Mr. Anthony Leung. He's the convener of the Big Education platform. Opposite to me is Mr. Zhang Leung. He's the executive director, charities and community of the Hong Kong Jockey Club. Quite honestly, I think that he's probably the most influential person in Hong Kong in driving social innovation. Well, if not the most influential, definitely one of the most. So perhaps, Thomas Piketty, Professor, that you need to bear with us for a moment, that because when you talk about the election and the political outcome, the political response with a capital P, here in Hong Kong, that probably we don't have a lot. Either because we won't be able to really change the administration through election anyway. And the second thing is, of course, outside of the government, we have very active and vibrant civil society. Anthony is very active in the sector of education and how to drive NGO activities in education to bring about changes. And as I said, Mr. Zhang Leung is very active in driving, not just handing out money from the Jockey Club, but also driving ideas of new initiatives in social innovation, in making a difference in addressing issues like inequality, poverty in Hong Kong. So maybe I'll ask Anthony to start first about how you respond to the issue, because when Professor Piketty talks about the lack of a political response, whereas in Hong Kong that I do think that we have responses, not political in the capital P, but some sort of response in addressing these sort of issues. And that's why we probably come in a very different micro picture in addressing those issues. But I'd like to ask Anthony to start first, and then later on, Mr. Zhang Leung.
Yeah, thank you, Dialogue. I think it will be fair to also introduce myself. I was the former financial secretary in Hong Kong. So I. Huh? At what time exactly? There was, let me think, 17 years ago. And before that, I was chairman of the Education Commission, and before that, I was chairman of the University Grants Committee. So in a way, I had something to do with education policies in Hong Kong, and also with the fiscal and economic policies in Hong Kong. And since then, I've been kind of thinking and commenting on some of these areas. I also ran chairman of 2 NGOs in Hong Kong. So obviously, I think your presentation is extremely interesting and insightful. Clearly, as I kind of read some of your presentations, the changes have been, in a way, quite apparent and obvious, to a certain extent because the world has changed from if I may say, an industrial economy to right now a knowledge economy or creative economy. So the world is not just between capitalists and workers. The world is now kind of, as you said, multi-functional and multi-elitist. To a certain extent, it's still between the haves and the have-nots, but the ability to create wealth is not just because of capital. It's because, I mean, in our view in Hong Kong, whether you have the ability to create particularly in the technology area, in the financial area, in what we generally call the knowledge sector. So people that are highly educated and highly creative would usually be able to capture the opportunities. And if I may dare add another dimension, and that is with a globalized world, particularly with the internet economy or the internet, the opportunity is now worldwide. So in Hong Kong, if I would like to think about the so-called you say the cleavage, or we say the rift between the two sides. If we think about a simple kind of 2-axis matrix, on one hand would be those people that would benefit from the knowledge economy, meaning those people that are educated can really benefit from the use of technology aided by finance, which is a huge sector that benefits from the current day of knowledge economy. And the other sector that are probably not as well equipped to capture. So mainly the other workers that may not be in the higher end finance technology sectors. Now in Hong Kong, obviously, we have one sector, which is the developers, and I'm kind of one of them. so we can use the capital. So that is one axis. The other axis is really people that can operate across the boundary, across border. Kind of beneficiaries of the globalization. The other would be mainly domestic. So if we think about these 4 boxes, and in the policy area, we also think about how do we make sure that the people in all four boxes would benefit. And that would be the way that I would think about, even though we do not really have party politics, but we have to make sure there is social harmony and not any particular sector would be kind of disadvantaged. So you would kind of jump to today's, right now the people that are most discontent would be people that cannot participate in these high-end sectors, technology, finance, or property development, mainly on the domestic side. So it's really people that are engaged in, say, retail, domestic, construction, domestic. These are really the people that are kind of complaining. And that's why some of them actually turn against globalization. And they call themselves nativism, nativists, or something, 本土. So that would be the Hong Kong landscape. But that actually may apply to other countries as well. And I think what we sometimes have to think about is how do we make sure that everybody can benefit from globalization, from the advancement in technology, because these trends are difficult to reverse. To a certain extent, the third factor that I commented earlier that contributed to the rift or the uneven distribution of wealth, globalization, technology, and the printing of money, these 3 forces, at least in the short term, are difficult to reverse. So we have to think about how do we make sure that while we, at least in Hong Kong, as I said in the beginning, we do not think about how do we suppress or reduce the income or the wealth inequality, because how can you suppress the kind of top-end people from making money because they can capture consumers from around the world by the use of very innovative technology and with the aid of money? It's difficult to suppress them. So it's just a matter of, at least in Hong Kong's view, making sure that we create opportunities for everybody through education, through opening up markets, and also giving them at least enough support so that they can live well, have a place to, in a way, innovate and create, to also catch on to the train of the creative economy. And that's why in Hong Kong we said we don't think about reducing the income or the wealth gap. We think about growth and we think about social mobility. So that's the way that I would kind of think, at least in the Hong Kong context. Now, even though we do not have party politics, we do have to think about the reaction of all the people, because social harmony is important. Now, luckily in Hong Kong, besides not having direct election, we are a very homogeneous race. We don't quite have all these social, cultural, or racial problems. So to a certain extent, we have a much simpler problem, even though obviously it is complex to some people. So that would be the way that I would respond, that at least that would be the way that I would think about it. Meaning, instead of thinking about the old kind of industrial age, capitalists versus the workers, is, as you said, multi-dimensional, multi-elitist. I won't kind of try to use the word elite, is those that can benefit from the technological era as well as from globalization versus the others.
Thank you, Anthony. Jonah?
Thank you. Professor Lui, thanks for the very kind introduction, first of all. If I may just also give you a bit of context of the Hong Kong Jockey Club. The Hong Kong Jockey Club is a very unique institution in Hong Kong. We have been around for over 130 years. We are set up as a not-for-profit organization, so there are no shareholders. We're the only legal license operator of horse racing in Hong Kong. And somehow people in Hong Kong and tourists around, they really like horse racing. So we try to organize responsible gambling, but it's a big income for Hong Kong. So basically what we do is then we channel the gaming income to tax and also to charities. So from a scale perspective, every year we pay up to about 7% of the total Hong Kong inland revenue income. So Anthony will probably know that figure very well. I'm sure when you were financial secretary, you look at that number as well every day and say, how's your race day? because that means a little bit to your income as well. So in a way, we channel the gaming demand into what we say for the betterment of society. In Chinese, sometimes we say 取之於島民，用之於市民. Okay, so that's the Hong Kong Jockey Club. Now we also, in the meantime, run a charities trust. So the charities trust is also fairly scalable with big scale. We are one of the top 10 globally charity donors. So every year we donate up to about $500 million of donations. In those donations, there are quite a bit of changes, I have to say, in the last 4 years. Actually, our past chairman, Dr. Simon Yip, is right here. So he basically led on this strategic transformation, provided the vision for us to do. So what happened was we changed more so sort of from a more reactive project vecting kind of organization to an organization whereby Professor Lui was just saying, very focused on social innovation, very focused on impact. And I think when it comes to inequalities, when it comes to sort of education in that sense, I have to say, we are a non-government foundation. Whatever we can do is very, very small relative to policy changes. And if you when you look around the world, even Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, when they're making $3 billion a year of donation, you take that as compared to the budget of, say, California, it's practically nothing, right? So we have to really understand then what an independent non-government foundation, what we can do, and what is the role we can serve in the path of hopefully, helping on the inequality issue. Now, I think that is absolutely very critical. So there are a couple of things that we believe. One is really about innovation. Once again, 4 billion Hong Kong dollar a year is a lot, but compared to the government's budget, for example, in education, the government budget 2 years ago was 80 billion, just on education. Now it's 120 billion, right? And in the 4 billion that we give every year, not every dollar goes to education. So the role that a philanthropic foundation can play is really then to think about how we can improve certain quality, right? And do new things that eventually, potentially, the policymakers can take reference so that they can do it in a bigger scale. So I'll very quickly give you an example. We're today in the Education University, so of course this is an example that we work with Stephen very closely. We have a program called Cool Think. Right? So the program idea is basically, when you think about technology, when you think about education, many people's original intent was to say, technology and education help us eliminate divides. But in reality, when you look at technology and education, in many situations, technology are owned by very few people. Few shareholders get rich very, very quickly. Not all stakeholders are benefited. Education, similarly, if you go to more resourceful schools, better schools, they generally have already higher starting point of the students, but then also they have better curriculum, better pedagogies. So not only you start higher, you also learn faster. So Cool Thing is a particular program we think about digital empowerment. Right? So for the underprivileged schools and for the underprivileged children, it's not a question of giving them an iPad or giving them just the hardware access. It's empowering them digitally so that they're not afraid. They can overcome the fear to say, I'm inferior. Right? So this particular program we put together, we work with Education University of Hong Kong. We work with MIT. We also work with the City University of Hong Kong. So the three universities plus us together, what we have done actually in the last 3 years already, is we work with 32 pilot schools. We already put together a new curriculum for primary 4 to 6. Right? So we tested them with 9 hours, 14 hours, 25 hours. So we also do control experiments as well. And then, long story short, so basically we have already developed a curriculum. EDB, Education Bureau, actually like it so much. So now we're sharing that 8 modules with all the primary schools in Hong Kong. We are now thinking about second phase. And MIT, interestingly, MIT is now talking to us and say, can we fund them to do this program in US? Actually, our money cannot go outside of Hong Kong. Let's make it very clear. So what happened was, in fact, 2 weeks ago, we organized a conference whereby we have a bunch of, in fact, US foundations coming into Hong Kong. So I pay for the dinner. But then over dinner, we actually try to hook them up to say, perhaps from Hong Kong, we can provide the intellectual property on this project. But then MIT can potentially be the organizer to implement the program in US, and then perhaps some US foundations can pick up the financial bill. So I think, once again, if I may come back to the issue of inequality, I think what the philanthropic foundation, what we can do, again, it's not fundamentally or through political system change or advocacy, at least not in Hong Kong. This is not in our forte. But I believe what we can do is whatever system it is, whatever way you are going to tackle this, there is always a question about, are you using evidence-based solutions? Have you tested that before? Can we use the philanthropic dollar almost like an R&D for social policies in various societies? So that's a big part. And of course, there's another part. It's really about filling some gaps. Because whatever policy a country, a city may have, there will always be some gaps. Right? When the policy priority is focused on perhaps driving more quality, perhaps driving the middle class to be better, who is to think about, say, artists of disabilities? Who is to think about perhaps the autistic kids? I think there's always a need for someone, for a foundation perhaps, or for multiple foundations, to perform that role, to be more flexible, to come to rescue very quickly, to perhaps before policy, try it out with, but then build evidence so that we can all benefit. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may impose my interpretation on the two responses from Zhang Leong and Anthony, Professor Piketty, that Hong Kong is on one side the paradise of capitalism, and on the other side, we have a bunch of typical utopian socialists, recognizing that we have social inequality, but work very hard on facilitating social mobility. Recognizing the limitation of NGO, but at the same time work very hard to drive social innovation. I don't know how you look at it from your own work, whether these people are doing something doable, or rather that you find that this is an outlier, so probably you can delete the file on the Hong Kong data from your data set.
First, I want to learn more about Hong Kong, so I'm not here to give lessons or anything. It's very interesting to hear what you both say. I had maybe two small reactions and questions. Yes, two small reactions or questions. Well, first, about transparency, to what extent is it possible, and it's really for both of you, is it possible in Hong Kong to draw the same kind of evidence and graphs that I was showing for the US, to relate parental income to access to higher education, or actually secondary education, and to what extent are we able, do we have the evidence, the facts, and how this has changed over time? Because otherwise, it's difficult to know how well we do and how this is changing. And on transparency also, I'd be curious to know whether whether you have some survey so that we know where the gambling revenue comes from in society. Who are the social groups who are playing the most, and so how progressive or how regressive the tax is. And then I have a second question, which was my main question, which is about the inheritance tax in Hong Kong. So maybe I got it wrong, but my recollection is that it was abolished in 2005, 2006. So I don't know if you were finance secretary at the time. Okay, no, too bad. But anyway, I still have the question. In your response, you seem to suggest, okay, we need to there is a response in terms of education and to inequality, but we don't want to suppress, the top wealth group, etc. I agree with you. We don't want to use the guillotine anymore. So we don't want to suppress them, that's for sure. Now, what about an inheritance tax in Hong Kong? And then my question is simply, why is it that China and Hong Kong, because after all, Hong Kong is part of China. Why is it that it's impossible to have an inheritance tax in China, Hong Kong, and it's possible to have one in Korea, in Taiwan, in Japan? Because the entire argument that if we have an inheritance tax, people will leave, they will disappear, there will be no economic activity, no economic dynamism. This should also be true in Taiwan and Korea and Japan, which are very small economies as compared to China, Hong Kong. So what's the point of being in a big country? And this is quite a big country, China. If we cannot conduct policies that reduce a little bit inequality, in particular, asking the people who have accumulated the most to contribute, not only through private charities. I mean, I love philanthropy as long as it comes in addition to taxation. But if it comes instead of taxation, which is what billionaires want to do, I have a problem. I think everybody would like to choose for themselves how much they want to contribute to the public good. But I would like to choose how much I pay in tax. But you cannot organize society like this. So if it's in addition to taxation, that's perfectly fine. But sometimes it's instead of taxation. Then it's really a problem. So what about an inheritance tax in Hong Kong?
Okay, before asking Anthony and Zheng to respond briefly, I would like to open, to the floor, because I'm sure that there are people around here very eager to ask a couple of questions. But sorry to say that I probably will only have time to collect 3 to 4 very precise and concise questions, and then we'll come back to the panel. Okay? I saw one here, the other here, and this gentleman and over there. Okay? 4.
Do you hear me enough, or?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Julie Mehta, PhD here. I'm in Hong Kong on environmental economy. I have 2 really brief questions. The one really practical and the control variable on education, because over the last century, education actually, I can talk about France only, but the quality changed a lot. So people that went to primary school before, they were able to do more than people that sit secondary nowadays in terms of orthograph, history, and math. So how do you control for this quality of education? But maybe we can answer by email or because it's more practical. The other one, you talk about progressive taxation on wealth and income. What about taxation and policy on the environment? How does it impact inequality and globalization so far?
Okay, thank you. Yep.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. This is Xiaoling Zhang from City University of Hong Kong. My question is, I wish to present to Professor Thomas Piketty. The reason is, I think with the time we are entering into the age, I think it's beginning of the end, or we say the end of the beginning of the globalization, because the political power and also the higher advanced technology such as AI, they will try to greatly shape the structuring of the social-economic transformation in the near future. So what we couldn't prevent or we couldn't predict is the unpredictable, the structure between, the irresponsibility or irreplaceable of the capital and the labor. So if we can imagine in the future when the AI will be displaced the labor, so how can we predict the future forthcoming way of the social and economic development structure? Thank you.
Okay, this gentleman. Yep.
Yeah, regarding the inheritance tax, I'm just wondering if Hong Kong and China are not compensated by owning the land. If you buy a house or anything, the government will still own the land. This is not the case in Taiwan or places. So I'm just a comment.
Okay, this is a comment. And lastly, that.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas, for the very articulate speech. So I'm a social democrat, identify as a social democrat, trying to move forward the Bernie Sanders movement. So I'm wondering, how do you think, as you can see or feel about the Hong Kong's environment, it's quite a capitalist society. So what would be your comments or suggestions towards social democrat movement in Hong Kong? And the second question is about the education policy. How do you think about a meritocratic-based education system and affirmative action-based education? And which one do you think is more effective in addressing inequality? And how would you persuade the other side to use whichever that you think is more preferable or desirable in addressing inequality? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So,
But what about the inheritance tax? We should.
okay.
Well, firstly, I did not abolish the inheritance tax, but I'm not against abolishing it. But I would only comment on Hong Kong because, as you know, Hong Kong is given one country, two systems treatment by the central government, which inherently means that they will not interfere with us and we don't interfere with them on the internal policies. So I would only comment on the policies in Hong Kong. Now in Hong Kong, because we are such a small economy, we only have 7 million people. We are, as I said before, the freest economy in the world. Everything is open. We do not have many of the sectors that you have. We don't really have agriculture. And our manufacturing itself actually has moved into the mainland of China. So in order to thrive, at least in my view, the way to compete really is to attract, number one, the best talents from around the world, and obviously develop our own talents, because in the knowledge economy or the creative economy, it really is talents, creative and educated people that makes all the difference. Secondly, we are a financial center, so we want to capture all the capital to transact and be based in Hong Kong. So that's why in many occasions in the government and after the government, I've been advocating that the way for us to thrive is to 聚財, meaning 聚人才and 聚錢財, which means we want to develop and attract talents from around the world, develop and attract capital from around the world. And in order to do it, we have to have systems, including our tax system, that can attract all these talents. Now, obviously, for talent, it's not just the tax, it's also the freedom which we have under the one country, two systems, have the lifestyle. Lifestyle is very important for talents. I often quote the example of Google. 40% of Google's employees do not live in Mountain View, which is 40 minutes from San Francisco. They live in San Francisco because of the lifestyle. And Hong Kong has the lifestyle. Because of all these, including the tax system, we are attracting a lot of talents from around the world. Actually, one of the nationalities that have been increasing fairly rapidly is actually from France. I think the Consul General can probably attest to it, because you have a system that probably will not be attractive enough for the talents or the high-income people. So besides the inheritance tax, as you know, our top tax rate is 15%, 1.5. And in Hong Kong, only less than 10% of the workforce pays 15%. The rest pays much less. Most of the people actually do not pay anything. We have zero capital gains tax, zero withholding tax on interest, zero on dividend, and zero and then obviously zero on the inheritance tax. And my successor abolished it because during my time, we were running a 6% GDP budget deficit. I could not have the room to do it. So because of all these, is in a way our policy to make sure that our tax system is not just low tax, but very simple, to attract talents from around the world. So it goes contrary to obviously your proposal in your book of a global tax on wealth. But obviously yours would be very effective maybe in reducing inequality, but I kind of say with respect it's not possible to implement because of competition from entities such as Hong Kong.
Okay, but here I was talking about Taiwan and Korea.
Right, well.
Which are, so I was not talking of a global tax, I'm talking about two countries, so maybe your answer is that Hong Kong is too small as compared to Taiwan or Korea, and indeed it is smaller. But I'm not sure this puts an end to the debate entirely.
Right, and as far as China is concerned, as I said, I'm not going to comment because we, under the one country, two systems, will not comment on their policies. Whether it's right or wrong for them, let them comment.
Okay, but look, I want to say, of course, each country is free to choose its own policy, and of course, the two country, one system, or no, two system, one country. Okay, this should be highly, respected. But I just want to point out that, including in East Asia, you have different choices that are being made, and it's not as if Taiwan or Korea were huge countries as compared to. I mean, they are bigger in population than Hong Kong, but in terms of size of financial center, whatever, they are not necessarily huge, and still they don't conduct the same policy. So I think there's room for discussion, which is also a way to answer the question from the Social Democratic Party. I think it's important to try to put maybe that's probably very difficult, but to put the Hong Kong debate on taxation and education into a broader context, because I think we cannot just say, okay, there is only one strategy for Hong Kong and we don't care what the other part of the world are doing. I think I think it's possible to have innovation and to have growth in Hong Kong, and at the same time to reduce inequality. For education, I think, again, transparency about who accesses education is very, very important. Let me answer very quickly to the other question. The quality education, change in quality in education, how does it affect the results that I have shown? I would say it does not really affect, because what I've shown is a complete reversal of the gradient. So, which is the higher you go in education, the higher you used to vote for certain parties, and now it's the opposite. So, taking into account the quality, that's not going to reverse the order of education. I mean, secondary education is still more than primary and higher more than secondary, at least on average. There can be particular cases. So I don't think that will affect this, but of course that's very important in general. Carbon taxation and environmental taxation, that's extremely important. And I think, in my view, this reinforces the argument for taking rising inequality seriously and taking progressive taxation seriously, because many of these environmental tax and carbon tax that we need to implement and that we need to increase can be quite regressive. The people who are going to pay for them, that's going to be a bigger share of income or consumption, sometimes for lower income groups or middle income groups than at the top. So if you don't have other tax instruments, including progressive tax on income and wealth, that sort of compensate for this, that's going to make it even more difficult to make this acceptable. Artificial intelligence and the rise of robots, and again, I think that's another challenge which can make the issue of rising inequality even more important in the future. In one way, you could say it's not so important if a lot of the tasks that we do are replaced by robots, as long as we all own an equal share in the world stock of robots. The problem is of course, if the property of robots is concentrated in a few billionaires or groups that are living in small urban centers, where each urban center feel you cannot do anything to them, otherwise they go somewhere else, and at the end of the day you have the world stock of robots that is owned by a very tiny group, then this can be quite frightening. I don't think we will get there, because I think there will be democratic coalitions, there will be reaction to fight against this, but it's important to realize, and that's all what I'm trying to do, that it will require specific institutions, specific tax reform. It will. The story is that it will all be solved by the goodwill of people, by the goodwill of philanthropies, by the goodwill of techno-optimist billionaire, etc. This I don't believe. This I think will be really playing. Playing with our future in a way that can be very dangerous. There was another question on the land. So if I understand well, the question was maybe we don't have or we don't need an inheritance tax in China or Hong Kong, because the government is getting a lot of revenue from land property, and sometimes selling new lands for in China for doing new promotion projects. I'm not so sure. I mean, certainly this can bring revenue. So maybe you're right that this is one reason why the government maybe in China feels that they don't need to develop progressive taxation of inherited wealth or income, because they're still getting a lot of revenue through construction project and through transforming land in particular that was not constructed into newly constructable lands, and by selling the land at a price, so that in effect they're still getting a lot of revenue from that. The problem is that this source of revenue, it cannot replace progressive inheritance taxation in terms of reduction of inequality. Okay, because this extra revenue coming from land is not going to be come to you in a progressive manner. It's not going to be taxed. This is not going to be like taxing at higher rate rich people as compared to poorer people. In fact, it can be quite the opposite. In some cases, some of the way land is being sold for new investment project can benefit very small groups that are making, that have benefited from privatization in China. So I think it would be a mistake. Of course, I understand that China and every country in the world wants to build their own way, and China wants to build Chinese socialism, and that's perfectly fine and understandable. But the view that you can build Chinese socialism or any kind of Chinese model without any use of progressive taxation, because this is all backward Western invention, and I think is will be a big mistake. I think there are things that could be done at the level of China, given the size of the country, the government, in terms of a registry for financial assets. In fact, China, in a way, has more is more organized than some number of Western countries. So there are things that could be done in having a fair and progressive and transparent tax system, which could work very well. And maybe this will happen one day, but maybe we're quite far from that. I don't know. We'll see.
But my meaning was, Hong Kong or China, you don't own the land of your own.
I understand.
It's a lease.
Yeah, I understand. But still.
When they renew the lease, you have to pay again. And if you're rich and you have a lot of land, you will pay more.
No, but typically that's proportional to your land. That's not progressive. That's what I mean. Or is it progressive? I don't think this will be. No, I don't think this will not be like a progressive tax, because this progressive tax that I have shown you historically, what makes them special, and the reason why they led to a reduction in inequality is that because it's not as if everybody is paying 90% or 70%. People, the bottom of the population is paying 0%, then it goes up 5, 10, 20, 70, 80%. So this is what makes them redistributive. I don't think the land renewal of land right operates like that. Maybe it could operate like that, but I don't think this is the way it operates right now.
Okay, given the time limit, I'm sorry to say that I have to draw the discussion to the close. But I'm sure that you will find this is a very important discussion, and I'm also thinking that this is the beginning of this sort of discussion in Hong Kong. So please, before closing, join me by thanking Professor Piketty for his most engaging presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.